Welcome everybody to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series co-sponsored by two wonderful organizations, Alliance Française de Milwaukee and Youthaiti. We're going to get started in a moment. I'm Daniel from Boswell. While we're letting folks into the conversation, I'm just going to mention that Boswell has a vibrant virtual event series. You can find out more on boswellbooks.com. Welcome to a very special Boswell Book Company virtual event. We are so honored to be hosting Myriam JA Chancy and Mike Gauyo. We have two wonderful event co-hosts tonight, and each is going to say a few words about their organization. First up, we have Anne Laplay, the director of Alliance Française de Milwaukee, and thank you for bearing with me as I speak very poor French pronunciation.
Bonsoir. Good evening. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation with our good friends Daniel Golden, Boswell Book Company, Gigi Pomeranz, Youthaiti, who does fantastic work in Haiti, as well as Myriam Chancy and Mike Gauyo. About 10 years ago, in February 2012, the Alliance Française de Milwaukee helped organize a celebration of contemporary Haitian art, cinema, and literature 2 years after the catastrophic earthquake in Haiti of 2010. And the conference focused on the good things happening in Haiti, and especially the vibrancy of Haitian cinema, art, and literature, and included prominent award-winning Haitian filmmakers, artists, writers, and journalists living in Haiti or in exile. And I just want to remind people that Milwaukee has a special connection to Haiti because of the exceptional Haitian art collection at the Milwaukee Art Museum. It's really considered one of the best in the US and maybe the world. And I hope that one day Myriam, Mike, and all of you will be able to experience this wonderful exhibit. So merci. Thank you.
Our other co-host tonight is Gigi Pomeranz, the director of Youthaiti, a wonderful Milwaukee-based organization, though I believe Gigi is joining us from a little further outside Milwaukee. Welcome. She's here to say a few words. Welcome.
Well, first of all, thank you to Boswell Books for inviting me and Youthaiti to be part of this discussion. And thank you to Myriam Chancy for this amazing book about the 2010 earthquake. Youthaiti is an organization that was founded in 2008 and has been working in rural Haiti on ecological sanitation and sustainable agriculture since 2008. We work in the countryside pretty far away from Port-au-Prince. We are pretty near the area that was hit by the earthquake this past August. 80% of the homes in the area where we work were either damaged or destroyed. People, and then right following that, there was a huge storm. So people were out in the elements without any cover at that point. It's been very challenging. Haiti has struggled through a lot of things, and right now the political difficulties make the recovery from the earthquake and the storms that much more difficult. The president was murdered in July, and the government is very unstable, and gangs have taken over a lot of the areas that bring goods into the country. Right now, gasoline is in short supply throughout the country. You may have read about the difficulties that hospitals are having. We in Youthaiti are having those challenges as well, but our all local staff is dealing with them the best they can. Instead of getting on the motorcycles because there's no gas, they're on foot to help people figure out how to rebuild their homes, find safe places to have toilets, and help them find clean water to drink. So I saw that our website was posted, and I would love for you to check us out. Feel free to contact me to hear more about our response to the most recent earthquake, while we now get to hear this amazing rendition of the 2010 earthquake. So thank you again, Boswell and Myriam Chancy.
Oh, it is our honor for having you. And let's see if I'm muted this time. I wasn't. I am so honored to be introducing Myriam Chancy and Mike Gauyo. What Storm, What Thunder has just been released and has been winning awards and or raves and wonderful reviews, at which Dan DeCat called it sublime, a striking and formidable novel by one of our most brilliant writers and storytellers. Boswell's own Kay Wozwick, one of her favorite books of the year. The 2010 earthquake claimed 250,000+ lives and forever changed millions of others. Chancy paints vivid images of chaos, devastation, horror, confusion, brutality, and regret, but also compassion, tenderness, and hope. She distills extensive interviews into 10 captivating and twined stories that portray how seemingly similar traumatic experiences can have vastly different effects on individuals. Chancy is the HBA Chair in Humanities at Scripps College in Claremont, California, and has also written a number of nonfiction books, including Framing Silence, Searching for Safe Spaces, and Auto. And, I should have said, how do you say this word?
Autochthonies.
Autochthonies. Well, I'm embarrassed, but it does transnationalism, testimony, and transmission in the African diaspora. Mike Gauyo is currently executive story editor on Netflix's Ginny and Georgia and was a story editor on HBO's Insecure. He runs the mentorship program Black Boy Writes, Black Girl Writes. Wow, thank you so much, both of you, for being here. We are thrilled and would love to hear more. We're going to start out with Myriam Chancy saying a few words about the book and reading a short passage to get us in the bookstore mood, pretending that we're all in a bookstore surrounded by books and smelling the book fumes. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for having me, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you, Boswell's, and thank you, Anne and Gigi, Alliance Française. And Anne, I have seen the art, the Haitian art that's there in Milwaukee, and everybody should see it. There's so many beautiful treasures. And I just found out about Youthaiti through this program, and I'm happy to find out that you are working in the Southern Peninsula where so much support is still needed since the August 14th earthquake. And of course, I'm delighted that Mike could join me in the last event to launch What Storm, What Thunder, especially coming off of triumphant beginning to the final season of Insecure, which I spied on your social media. So thank you so much for being here and taking the time, because I know you're very busy.
Excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Myriam.
So should I start with short reading and then we'll go on in conversation?
Yes, I would love that. Would love to hear a short reading and maybe a quick synopsis for our attendees.
Yes.
About the book.
Thank you.
We'll get started.
Yeah, thank you everyone who's joining us both here on Zoom and I know on YouTube. And so just to give you a sense of the novel, it's told through 10 narrative voices, only one of which repeats, which is the voice of a 75-year-old market woman who's named Malou. And so I'd like to say she bookends the novel, she begins the novel and she ends the novel. And I chose her as the kind of framework for the novel because my own grandmother was my mother's grandmother, my great-grandmother was a market woman, a very successful one who by the time she passed on, was employing other market women and had a stall in the Marché de Fer, which was destroyed in the 2010 earthquake and rebuilt some years later. But one of the things that always struck me is that when we see images coming out of Haiti, especially when there is turmoil, photojournalists take pictures of market women, but they seldom interview them. And I think the market women of Haiti and in other places of the Caribbean know so much about global economics, about the society. So that's why I wanted her to be the spokesperson in a certain kind of way, carrying those voices in the novel. And what you'll find when you read the novel is that the marketplace is one of those places where everybody from every walk of life goes through. So the 10 narrative voices also split equally in terms of gender. Sexualities are also represented that are non-normative. There are children, So from a 75-year-old woman to an 11-year-old boy are represented. So a real cross section of the most wealthy to the least wealthy and perhaps the least voiced. But I wanted to start by reading from a teenage voice, partly because we're talking about Youthaiti here, as one of our co-sponsors. And I know that Mike has been mentoring programs for young writers. And I'm also a professor, hopefully mentoring young writers to be. And one of the reasons I have a teenage voice in the novel is that part of the work of the novel is to give a sense of how different people's lives were disrupted because of the earthquake. There are 3 family groups within these 10 characters that you discover in the novel, and one of them is Tafia's family. So you will hear from Tafia, who's 15 years old when the earthquake happens. You'll also hear from her older brother, Didier, who is a musician living in Boston, but not doing very well financially. And you also hear from her older sister, Sonia, who thinks of herself or identifies as M, which is the queer identity in Haiti, which signifies a little bit differently than in North America. And her best friend. So Sonia talks about her best friend, Dieudonné, and they both work the hotel. But Tafia is just a 15-year-old. And like every 15-year-old, she's thinking about who she's going to date. She's thinking about what happens in the schoolyard, who her best friend is going to be. And then this disaster just interrupts all of that flowering. So I'm going to read from just a brief section from her section where she describes what it's like to be, because her house is destroyed. One of the family members does die. And she, with the rest of the family, must relocate to an internally displaced people's camp, an IDP camp, so named for people who are refugees in their own country. And if you can see this picture over my shoulder of an older woman hanging, it's wash day, hanging her wash. This was a picture I took in the Champ de Mars in 2011. And I was really struck by the dignity of that image of an older woman on a day, Monday, hanging her wash at a time when there was no potable water really available, just the dignity of someone, and like everyone in the camps, just wanting things to go back to normal. So you'll hear a little bit about this image in Tafia's story. Sunday, we sorted the wash for Monday and put our few things in order by our beds on stools or little stands if we had managed to find or make some. Then the women went to mass, either to the churches in their old neighborhoods if they were still standing, or right there in the camp if there was a priest or pastor, or even a hugan, a healer, willing to hold a service. If they went back to their neighborhoods, it could be a long journey, but they were also glad because they were getting out of the squalor of a tent city for a while, even if it was back to the areas where there was nothing left to look at. Those were the days for dreaming and hoping and giving thanks for what was left if you had it in you. The remainder of Sunday was for rest and drawing up plans for the next week. Other tent cities probably worked differently, and within them there must have been variations, but I trusted the elderly women because they had lived long enough to have gray on their heads. To me, this was an achievement as significant as getting a high school diploma, or as Didier had done, having the faith to move to another country to start over. Getting old couldn't be a matter of simple luck. I walked through the camp, watching as each person acted out their rituals of the day against all the despair and fear they felt. The smallest of the children were playing together. Old men traded dominoes on boards laid across their knees. There was nothing else to do but keep an eye on one's dry corner of the world to sleep in before having to start the search for food, water, loved ones. It was hard to believe that only a few weeks before, all I had been thinking about was school matters, going to the clubs, and whether I would have friends or a date for a school dance. It was hard to believe that my life and that of my family was reduced to a small tent, no belongings except the blue box, which is a little iPod her brother sent her, and waiting. It was hard to believe that Tati was gone and would never return. It was hard to believe that only a few weeks ago, All I had cared about were things like my name and soap opera storylines and getting invited out by popular girls, and that now we were in a telenovela ourselves, hoping to awaken from a dream. Most of the time, all there was to do was think about the life we used to have, the life we used to want to escape, which now I realized was so much better than what we had been reduced to, waiting in the camp. I'll just stop there.
That was beautiful. What I'd like to say about the novel as a whole is that it's written incredibly well. The prose are amazing, especially when you're dealing with tough subject matter. You do it with so much grace and respect, and for these characters, for these people, that you really see when you're reading it. You know, there are certain moments that are more on the gruesome side or just a tougher to read, but it doesn't feel that way because there's so much care that's given to these individual characters. So I love that so much.
Thank you.
To speak to the excerpt you just read, for a lot of these characters, and especially for Tafia, it's like they're wanting to get back to a sense of normalcy, right? To something that feels familiar to them. And I could actually link that to my own experience with the earthquake. At the time, back in 2010, I was living in Boston, and my parents and my sister, who's 4 years younger than me, was in Haiti at the time. My parents used to travel back and forth for business. And whenever they traveled, they took my sister because my sister has cerebral palsy. She doesn't walk or talk, so it's easier for them to just travel with her and be, you know, have a caretaker take care of them wherever they go. So imagine me, the earthquake happens, and in Boston, it's just myself and my younger brother. My younger brother is 12 years younger than me. At the time, he was 11, and I was, you know, in college. And the idea of potentially having to raise him myself is something that I had to combat. Not being able to reach my parents for 3 days was something that I had to combat. And the whole entire time, thinking about waking up and still making breakfast and still going about my day, I craved it. I craved it because I didn't want to face the trauma of what was happening to me. And I feel like I see that in these characters as well, just wanting to, craving to getting back to a place that felt normal.
That's right.
You know? Thankfully, my parents were fine and they were able to move back. They were able to travel back to the States, you know, in military cargo planes, but still its own traumatic experience, but still were able to come back and everyone was fine. But that's my personal experience. And down the line for our conversation, I would love to hear everyone else's experience and where they were during the time of the earthquake and how they felt. But to get back to these characters, I love discussing first of all, I love the demographic of the individuals from like younger to older. I think it's a fantastic way to to experience the same catastrophe, but different through different lenses.
Right.
One thing that is strange, but also tragic for like millennials or Gen Zers or people coming up is that we have suffered through the we have gone through the earthquake. We've seen that. We've seen Katrina, we've seen 9/11, we've seen Sandy Hook, we've seen, you know, for some of us, Columbine. We've seen certain things that help shape our view of the world and help shape the way our upbringing, right? These were incredibly traumatic experiences that this section of the community or of people share, and how that shapes who they end up becoming. So my question to you is, and you slightly talked about it, but what was your decision to involve these kind of like more adolescent perspectives of this major tragedy?
Yeah, there's so much I want to respond to. I mean, I'll start with a question and kind of climb my way back, and maybe that will get you to the next question too. I decided that because one of the things I've always been interested in, worked on women's issues, and working on women's issues usually entails also working on children's issues, especially in Haiti, because the primary care for the children tends to fall to the women. And so I've always been aware of the precarity of what it means to be a child in Haiti, even thinking of when I would go back, when my family, I was born in Port-au-Prince, and I stayed back for a time, before being brought to Canada, for more formal schooling. So I started school in Haiti and then was left for a year and a half, and then my parents moved to Canada, and then, we continued from there. But we would go back every summer until I was 8, until, interestingly, we were mainstreamed into English school. And then the family started to come to see us. And I'm not sure if there's a connection with a language shift, but that's just how it came out. But my impression as a child was not that we had emigrated, was simply that we were going to school in Haiti, in Canada, and that, we lived in Haiti. So I didn't understand until I learned English, actually, that I no longer lived in Haiti. And I say that because when we would go back, I would encounter children who, were already working at age 5, 6, 7, just going to the market, with a family member, and I would encounter children who were working. And I remember thinking about and asking the question, why are they, in the street? Why is this child not going to school? Or can I play with that child and then being told that child is working, And so since that moment, I always had a very strong sense of not only of my privilege, but of the ways in which children in Haiti, often, from poor working classes, are witness to so much and have to endure so much. And so I couldn't tell the story of the earthquake without including children's lives, teenage lives, trying to encompass every aspect of the society and making sure that children's voices were included. Not only the innocence of those voices, with the 11-year-old who doesn't yet know much about life except the beauty of it, regardless of whether his family has a lot or not. And this is the character of Jonas, or somebody like Tafia, who is just waiting to break out into her own and do what she wants, and and is fractured and has terrible experiences in the IDP camp. So the other thing too is that in the months and years after the earthquake, because I'm known as a specialist in women's literature and women's issues in Haiti, I was asked to speak a great deal during that time. And one of the things that we had to talk about and confront was the level of sexual violence that occurred in the camps in those first weeks and months, until the communities organized themselves because they realized no one was coming to provide security for the general population. And young men who were also themselves feminists, even if they might not use that word, organized, policing groups within the camps to protect, their own families and everyone else. And so I couldn't write this novel without including something of what happened in some of the camps. And Tafia, in some ways, carries that voice. Olivier does too, actually, a different family group of mother, father, and child. So this is Jonas's father, who ends up in a different IDP camp than his wife to look for work. And this is inspired by a real camp that was created outside of the capital, where a factory was supposed to be built, which was never built, but thousands of people were displaced from Port-au-Prince very soon after the earthquake with a promise of work. And so he ends up there. And he, in his storyline, you see him policing that camp for security purposes, but then also being subject to some violence. So that was why I wanted to give a sense of different ages and the genders and so forth. But to climb back into what you're telling about your personal story, but it also connects to your question, is that in going back to Haiti in 2011 and after, in doing a lot of work with grassroots organizations and having a lot of conversations with people who had survived the earthquake or lost individuals there, and then in my own family, because we lost a member of our family, and one of my uncles who lost his mother in the earthquake was also, he's passed away since, but was also an undertaker, because my grandfather had and undertaking business, which the family has carried on. Everyone had different points of view about their experience of the earthquake, their experience of what they wanted to see in the future, and the levels of trauma that they lived with or refused to live with. And even in that refusal, still living with trauma. And so I wanted the novel, through those 10 perspectives, to provide a sense of how complex not only the society is, but how complex moving forward, if one can even call it that, but moving in time forward past the earthquake might even, how that might look, that people were not agreed about how to move forward, whether on a personal level or, on a national level. And so I wanted to move away from the kind of massification that you get in headlines, where it's just for Haitians, Haitians want this or Haitians want that, to let's look more deeply, more intimately on how an individual or a family group might respond and have a more humanized perspective on the earthquake.
I love that. I love that. And I love that you added within these 10 people, the family aspects and how each sibling was reacting to things differently. What I'll also say is, you make a point in the beginning to say or express how many people were lost, like the range of how many people were lost. But what's interesting about that is that there are two deaths.
Yes.
There's the actual death of the person, right? And there are the deaths of certain ideas.
That's right.
Of the people that are still existing.
That's right.
And that is another death that's occurring for them.
That's true.
I love how we kind of like toggle between the two, because you express what happens before the earthquake, but also after the earthquake, and kind of like exploring these characters in that way, because they have also experienced a death. Like they have also experienced loss, and they're having to start over and rebuild it from the rubble that still exists. But yes, I find that.
But speaking to that, I have a paragraph that I thought I would read spontaneously. This was not prepared, actually.
Look at that.
Because I didn't know that you were in Boston at the time of the earthquake, and we have the character Didier, who was in Boston at the time.
Yeah.
And this is just a very quick paragraph at the end of his section, which speaks to what you've just said about the two deaths, where he says, burials without ceremony, bodies dumped in mass graves to protect the living. I watch it unfolding on my TV screen. It had to be done, malpropre, untidy. The dead are so many, they cannot be counted. There is no before, no way to think before. There is only the not knowing of how to put the before together with the now. Before is a distant memory. I'm still waiting to hear from those I loved before, waiting to hear if I can say I love still, or if everything will remain past tense, what it was. No beyond, no goodbyes, simply after. So I think it's kind of encapsulates what you just talked about, this idea that there are the dead, the physical dead, but then there's another process of things that you'll never be able to reclaim.
Absolutely. And that's actually one of the, I guess, excerpts that came to mind while explaining my perspective on that. It's just, it's wild when like, large tragedies happen like this and these things come about, and you're having to kind of answer these questions and face certain ideas, not just about yourself, but about other people after a large tragedy like that has taken place. So I think that's fantastic. Just to slightly segue away from that for a moment, I know that we have been talking about youth, and we've been talking about like their importance in terms of like the grand scale of the overall novel. And you spoke slightly about why it felt so important to include them, and I think that's great, because I feel like they really inform who they're going to be. It really informs who they're going to become,
right?
And how it shapes their current world and their current like point of view. So with that said, when you are teaching and you are molding other minds, like what do you keep in mind for yourself when thinking about these more like adolescent characters as it relates to the students and the minds that you're molding?
Yeah, well, I teach, so in everything I teach, and I teach mostly in Caribbean literature and post-colonial literature and theory, and occasionally in creative writing. And when I teach in creative writing, I tend to teach, interestingly, I teach memoir writing, but I will teach fiction, autobiographical fiction in that course, because I think that young writers often aren't quite sure what to write about. And it's nice to give them examples of people who have used their own life stories as a way to enhance or fuel their imagination. So it's not that it's the fiction is memoir, but they're taking pieces out of their lives. And conversely, people who write memoir fictionalize events so that it's readable. So it's a nice way of sort of demonstrating how you can use elements of your life to feed into whatever story you want to tell. But I think one of the things I love to teach most, and maybe this is where I can make a connection to my own writing, is voice, which is how do you get into somebody else's mindset? How do you get under their skin so that you can become that person? But it begins with knowing yourself. So this is the connection to memoir and autobiography. You have to know yourself well enough so that you can get out of your way, so that you can give voice to somebody else and do it justice, And then it's all a matter of figuring out, well, what is that person's voice? What would they speak like? And then with the youthful voices, I'm now past 50. I have to, sort of think about voice in a way that I'm more attuned to a younger voice and what they would care about and what they would think about. And so interestingly, with my youngest character, who was 11, in the working draft, he was a little bit younger, but I was also trying to make sure that he existed as a kind of in-between soul, so that he knew more than someone that's maybe 7 might know, but that the reader wouldn't be quite sure until quite late whether this character was alive or passed over. But they needed to have this kind of mystical quality. But one of the things that I would hear from when I would give readings or from editors was like, are you sure he's 7? And then I had to kind of go and think to myself, am I sure he's 7? And I made him a little bit older because he needed to be credible as a child. And it made more sense to make him, because I wanted to keep the poetics in his voice, it made more sense to keep him a little bit older. And so with students, we talk about those kinds of things, and I love, there's actually an exercise from Naomi Goldberg's, I think it's called Writing the Bones, that I really like, where she imagines, being an animal. And so I do this exercise with my students, and I do it at the beginning of a course, and then I do it again at the end of a course, and they see a vast difference in their capacity. Just imagining the world from the point of view, for example, of an elephant as opposed to a cat, a small person as opposed to, someone who's quite tall. How would you negotiate the material world and these kinds of things? And by the end of a course, go ahead.
No, I love that, because I mirror a lot of that in my writing as like a TV writer and film writer. We do a lot of the same thing, where you really have to put yourself in that person's shoes and imagine yourself as a teen again. Even on Ginny and Georgia, we're writing storylines for these teenagers. I have to think, there are certain storylines that we write or certain pieces of dialogue where we have to sit back and say, I don't think this conversation would go like this. I think these sound like very mature adults.
Right.
It's slightly messier for teens. It's slightly, it's more in the unknowing or not knowing than it is in the knowing, And sometimes it takes a tone pass to be able to go back and say, hey, maybe this is not right for this character. And I do the same thing with my mentees, similar to how you do with your students. You tell them, you express to them how certain things should go or how certain things should feel, just based on your own personal experience and wanting to kind of like pass that on. So to say, I have a mentorship initiative, as Daniel mentioned earlier.
Yes.
It's called the Black Boy Rights and Black Girl Rights Mentorship Initiative. It's meant for pre-WGA writers of color who are on the cusp of making it into writers' rooms, or on the cusp of transitioning, into their next act, into their second act, and wanting to write. There's going to be a submission process for a new up-and-coming class for 2022, coming in late November, early December. So, chat about that later. But yes, I say that there's a craft in being able to make things feel nuanced and different and specific while still making it universal.
Right.
And I'll say that What Storm, What Thunder is a classic in that way, similar to, I don't know, Jane Austen, similar to The Grapes of Wrath, similar to, those novels where it's going to continue to live on, because not only is it expressing specific experiences of people you may never have met in your life, but it still feels extremely universal and you connect to it. So,
that's so nice.
I mean, kudos to you for being able to express that in so
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been an interesting experience to see the novel take off in very widely different circles in terms of, who has endorsed it and where it's been circulating in terms of all the fall lists that it's gone on. It's been amazing to see how people have connected to it in very different ways, And I recently, and most of the time I've heard from people who are not Haitian or who have not been to Haiti, how they connected to the characters, and which it's been interesting also to see who's connected to what characters. So a number of people who are US based have connected to DDA, who is in Boston. That was excerpted in Harper's Bazaar, or Harper's, the literary version of Harper's. And then, then I was interviewed by a Canadian journalist who is also from the Caribbean, and he has a teenage daughter. So for him, the novel was all about Tafia. She's the central character. And so I thought that was really interesting,
I love that. I love how people latch on to like their favorite character.
And interestingly, for different readers, it hasn't seemed to matter which of the characters was for them the most, that they were most taken with. For some reason, for them, the way people are reading the novel, even though I think of it as being, embellished by Malou, the elderly woman, it seems like there's a kind of way in which each of a character feels prominent depending on who's reading the novel, which has been interesting. But I have to say that I got my not to sideline Margaret Atwood or Edwige Danzica, who gave great endorsements. But I think I got my most heartwarming endorsement recently with a young Haitian bookstagrammer who currently lives in Port-au-Prince, who read the novel and did live through the earthquake as a child, from what I can tell from her current age, and lived in an IDP camp. And she said, this is what I went through. This is true for her. And recommended the book to all survivors of the earthquake. And so to me, it's fascinating that there is this kind of universalism to it, that somebody who lived through the earthquake can find themselves in it, and someone who has no sense of Haiti could also find themselves in it. So
absolutely,
really nice.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I would love to talk about Malo, because being able to have a narrator when you have so many different characters is extremely important. And I want to go and just talk about your decision to do that. But she's kind of like the Greek chorus in a sense, she follows these individuals, and she does it in a way that connects each person. And the fact that you made her like the Mache, woman is fantastic, because everyone was going through there. Everyone was going through the marketplace. That's so at any point in time, they could have crossed paths.
That's right.
And the idea that she is there every day and able to view all these people, and from a wholly different lens than they're viewing themselves or each other, is fantastic and so incredibly important for the storytelling aspect of the novel. So can you talk a little bit more about your decision to have this character as like the narrator?
Yeah. I mean, I wanted the reader to get a sense that in a way they're being watched, right? Because she starts the novel by saying, I listen, I'm giving people what they want, I listen. And so then all the stories that follow, you have a sense that she's listening to all their stories as she's hearing them, and then you're hearing them. But you might also get this kind of eerie feeling like, you're being watched by the market women, as you're reading. I hope that you do. But it is interesting that at the beginning of the novel, I think this is on page 10, she talks about the market women, their reaction to the earthquake. I could read a little paragraph here because I like the way she talks about herself. And I know I wrote it, but there are moments where I feel like some of the characters kind of dictated they kind of said, this is how I feel about who I am. But this is a little paragraph that kind of reflects how she talks about the women and the way that you're describing as a kind of Greek chorus. So she says, eventually we, the market women, remembered our oil lamps and lit them one by one, those of us who could. Only part of the market had been crushed, the part against the wall. Still, it was impossible to tell what belonged to whom. And at that point, no one cared. We worked at freeing those we could, said prayers for the others, promising deliverance to those we could not get to give them some solace, some hope in their final moments, because salvation would soon be theirs. Then back down the street, darting back and forth, using the goods from the market to feed those working at rescue, doing what we could, as we always did, our large bodies moving through the rubble as if we were land whales, made for swimming through dust-laden air, made for parting human waves. And so this image of the land whales came to me as I was hearing this voice, who's describing herself and the other women in the marketplace as something larger than life in a way. And these are the same women that so many people ignore. And so for me, especially being the great granddaughter of a market woman, it just felt right to give that kind of power over the narrative, over the storytelling, to women who do so much and who sustain the economy. I mean, let's be honest, who sustain the economy, but who are always sort of walked by, talked over, talked down to, sometimes, talked to for advice, by people, local people, but who are most often ignored, especially by, the higher society. And so I wanted her to have that kind of agency and that kind of power. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I was thinking something similarly to your answer. I just wasn't sure. And yeah, what you're saying is fantastic. And to that, because you take so much care of these characters, because it's tough subject matter told so like eloquently within these prose, what made you think of this title, What Storm, What Thunder? Because I feel like it's an incredibly strong title. Yeah. One would think that there's a lot of violence in it, but it's quiet. It feels quiet. So where do you think that comes from? And the reason I say it feels quiet is because it is the threat of violence, but not violence.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on?
There's a kind of questioning in the title, right? Because you could almost have a question mark, what storm, what thunder, like what's going to happen? And there's also a kind of quiet in the sense that if one knows that it's about the earthquake, of course, we know that it was, larger than life. It was, when people talk about their memory of the earthquake, that it was thunderous. There was a lot of noise. And so there was a sense in which I wanted to sort of soften, one's entry into the novel through that title, while also invoking a kind of sense of an epic nature of the happenings, But the title comes from a few different places in the novel. The working title was actually Douze, and moved away from that because, most Anglophones wouldn't know what douze meant. But also because douze in the United States, 12, the number 12, signifies differently, usually is code for police. And so we didn't want to have a misunderstanding around the title. And well, especially given all of what we've been going through in the US and Canada, actually, the last years around police brutality, it would, which is a very important topic. And if people thought the book was about police brutality and then they thought, it's about something else, then it would not find its audience,
Yeah, it would have taken away from the subject matter at hand. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that, and I love your explanation of the title. That's fantastic. Let's see here. I definitely wanted to talk about your process as a writer. I know my process as a TV and film writer is, amongst TV and film writers, I know my process is different from some people. But I've always wanted to, and not yet have attempted to write a novel. So I would love to know two things. First question, how long did it take to write this masterpiece? And also, what is your writing process when writing a novel?
Ooh, and those two questions might be answered in one and the same way, I suppose. So when I was younger, I wrote much more quickly. I tended to, I know The Scorpion's Claw, which is the second novel I published in the UK, but it was the first novel that I wrote in my mid-20s. I wrote in about 5-6 weeks. And it took 10 years to publish, but I didn't revise it in that time. Whereas this novel took 7+ years. So maybe 5 to 7 years to get to what felt like the final product ready to show to editors. And then of course, one goes through an editorial process. And so it goes through a couple of more drafts, through the editors. And it went through one process first in Canada, because it was first acquired by HarperCollins Canada. And then it went through a sort of tightening process when it went in-house to Tin House. And then they co-published in Canada and the US. So I would say, so I started in 2013. It was more or less finished in 2018, and then went in-house 2018 to 2020, and then we go through the copy editing and until it emerges as the finished product. Right. And it as the older I get, the longer it takes me to write a book, which is an interesting process in itself to observe. So on the one hand, maybe I feel less, when I was younger, I always felt like this has to come out immediately. And sometimes that was true. For my academic work, there was a kind of pressure. For example, when I wrote Framing Silence, which is still the only book on Haitian women's literature in English. And, I published that in 97. And it was, the impetus for it was that my first position was at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And in 94, when I joined that university, the US sent troops, to occupy Haiti. And as the child of two people who were born at the end of the US occupation, who had a long memory of that occupation, I didn't have good feelings about that intervention. And I started researching as a literary critic, well, what have, Haitian women have had to say? And I found out that Haitian women started producing novels during the US occupation. And then at every juncture that there was a political, something happened politically in Haiti, a book emerged that tended to be the signal book for that generation or that event from a female Haitian woman's perspective. And so that book I needed to get out quickly, and there was a lot of interest in it. And so that's why it came out. It was written quickly. It came out quickly. I feel somehow chagrined that no one has written like a book 2, because I'm not going to write it. But, somebody should follow up. Mm-hmm. And I think with this novel, I felt the same pressure initially, that not in terms of publishing quickly after the earthquake, because I was not going to write this novel. I didn't want to be, somebody who, sort of got on that train where people started working on Haiti who had no experience. Of course, I have that background and I have experience, but I didn't decide to work on the novel until I saw other writers, Haitian writers in Haiti, starting to publish on Haiti, on the earthquake itself, and also Caribbean artists reflecting on what it meant to them to have solidarity for Haiti. And that's when I realized that all those years of giving talks on Haiti after the earthquake and having survivors tell me their story was a kind of charge that they had given me as a writer to do something with those exchanges and to do something creatively. So that's why I started, 3 years later, as opposed to immediately after. But in that process, there was a moment where I felt like I needed to hurry up, because the attention to the earthquake was starting to wane some years in. And I remember my mother, who has since passed, gave me the best advice. She said, there are still people working on the Second World War. Every year there are new books on the Second World War and people read them. So it doesn't matter how long you take. The important thing is to get it right,
Absolutely.
And that's partly also why the book is dedicated also to her, because of the perseverance, because she was my first reader, one of my first readers, and she also diligently checked and counter-checked all of the Creole. And so she's still with me in spirit through the novel.
I love that. And Becky just said something in the chat. She said that was great advice from her. And I thoroughly agree, because, we have these moments in our lives where we have huge events that take place, and those events stay with us for generations. There are stories that are told down to the next generation, to the next. It's in the history books for life, and it will always live there. So that was some fantastic advice from her. And I know we are getting to that time where we may want to take audience questions, but I have one more thing I'd love to discuss.
Sure.
It's the topic of home.
Hmm.
I feel like that is incredibly kind of like an important theme in the novel, especially when expats are coming back home, they're coming back to their country. How do you create home after such a catastrophic event taking place? How do you kind of like rebuild that back from the rubble? So what was your, I want to say that was intentional, but also wanting to hear your perspective on that becoming a major theme in the novel.
This idea of whether or not one could return home, or
whether or not one could return home, of whether or not one can rebuild home.
Yes.
So I'd love to hear your perspective.
So I wonder sometimes to myself if one of the reasons that theme emerges and reemerges in the novel is because when I started writing this novel, I had a very strong sense for myself of the impossibility of returning, or at least of returning as I had before, in a sense, returning as a child, returning as a child of Haiti, as a child in my family, because most of my family that remains in Haiti is older. And there was a moment when I went back and saw how the reconstruction was not helping the average Haitian, when I saw the 3 or 4 star hotels go up, most of which are closed now, by the way. But there was a feeling like the Port-au-Prince that I used to know didn't exist any longer. And the Port-au-Prince that was being built wasn't for Haitians. And so there was this very odd feeling of not only of as you were talking earlier about the 2 deaths, when you're talking about, the physical deaths of people we lost in the earthquake and then something larger. I think I went through this passage of the something larger in a very personal way, and so I feel like that seeped into a question that maybe I asked of the characters, what is home for you now, wherever you are? And the answers were different depending on the outcome of those characters, right? And I won't give away anything for people who may not have yet read it, but not everybody survives, but everybody goes home in a certain kind of way. And so home for some of the characters might be another person in the novel, right?
I love that. Even homegoing or homecoming, yes. Yeah, I love that.
Or it could be the landscape. It could be returning to the landscape. Or it could be a wish, like the Boston character where he wishes to go home, but we don't see that happen, So maybe I landed on the idea that home was not a physical place, but something larger, even if we couldn't regain what was lost from before.
You did, and you did that brilliantly. I love that. I love that so much. I know that I would love to get to audience questions. Miriam, is there anything else you would like to say before we dive in?
No, I think I see one question. I see a couple of questions. I'm happy to answer them.
I do. I will read the question first.
Mhm.
And for everyone who would like to ask questions, there should be a Q&A tab where you can just insert your questions. Don't insert it into the chat because I'm not looking at that right now, but there's a
Okay.
specific Q&A tab that you can click on to
Yes.
ask your question. So please use that setting or use that feature. My first question is gonna be from Florence. Florence says, thank you for this, which gave us so much to think about. Writing this novel must have been an exhausting as well as a cathartic experience. Can you envision writing another fictional work about Haiti at some point in the future?
Well, Florence, I have to say, is a good friend that I've known for a very long time. She actually chaired my PhD dissertation, so I'm really happy to see her here.
Hi,
Lovely,
Florence.
lovely Victorianist, specialist in the Victorian era. So yeah, it was cathartic in some ways. It was painful in others, but I would say not as painful as, you know, what clearly people experienced on the ground, which is why I persevered with it. And also is one of the reasons it took so long, you know, thinking back to Mike's earlier question. And every time I finish a novel on Haiti, I say to myself, I have other stories I want to tell. I'm going to write about something else. And then Haiti returns, which maybe also gets back to what Mike was saying about home, in the sense that I'm in some ways so anchored in Haiti in terms of how I was brought up in my early years, but I tend not to pivot far. So I actually started a new novel when this novel came out in Canada in September. Actually, I started working on something new, which is going to deal with Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So my mother was half Haitian of Dominican descent, which is unusual. And so I am thinking about I am working on something to do with half sisters where they are a part Dominican descent, but Haitian, and exploring that dynamic through their story. So it will happen again, but hopefully it will be less painful.
All right. Well, we will be looking forward to reading that as well. Let's see. I have something from Patrick, but we can discuss it, but I'm not sure if it's a question per se. Patrick says, I presume that the novel's has been translated into French, but it would be absolutely essential for it to see a Creole translation as well, since so many of the characters are I don't know, I'm trying to pronounce it. Du people?
Du peuple. Du peuple.
Yeah, du peuple. Pardon me, my Creole, everyone. I could suggest some translators in Haiti, people who know.
Well, I'll definitely take up Patrick on the offer of connecting. So Patrick is a specialist in Haitian studies in Milwaukee. I don't know if he's really located from there, but I was at the University of Milwaukee. And I think he can correct us. His father or grandfather wrote what he knows I consider to be the best history of Haiti. So his grandfather or father wrote L'Histoire d'Haïti in, I think, 1948 or 1950 something. And it is still my touchstone when I need to check some particular historical moments that I don't know enough about. I consult that work. I agree, Patrick, but I'm hoping for translations. I think Tin House, or actually HarperCollins, is working on finding a French translator. Creole translators are harder to come by, and so I will definitely connect with you on that, and hopefully it will soon appear in French and or Creole in the future.
I love that. That's fantastic. Are there any more questions for Myriam? Are there any more questions?
His grandfather, Dantes Bellegarde.
Grandfather.
It's a great. I have an original copy, which is falling apart. which was my mother's. But if anybody can find that, it's absolutely worth it. And that should be translated into English.
That's fantastic. And speaking of, translating or even, adapting, if you're ever interested in adapting this into a series or a feature, look no further.
How do you feel about it? Do you think it's adaptable? Can you see it in your mind's eye?
I do think it's adaptable, especially these, different perspectives, and the fact that it just hits several different demographics. I do think it's adaptable.
There's been talk about it, so I should have somebody contact you.
No, that would be great. I would love that. It's fantastic. So with that said, we are going to close this out. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fantastic chat. What Storm, What Thunder. If you've not read it yet and you're sitting in our audience, please read it. There is an audio book version available. You can do that as well. And everyone, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for coming in. Daniel?
Thank you to both our co-sponsors, and thanks for all of you for showing up. We wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you, or one in person too. Continued success to both of you. We were thrilled to host this event tonight.
Thank you so much for having me,
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having us. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, and can I just do one more plug before we go? I know people have to go. I'm wearing this beautiful scarf from artmatenois.org, and I forgot to mention them, but I wouldn't be as imaginative as I am if I didn't look to Haitian art. And these scarves are handmade by Haitian women in Lagonave, Haiti. And I'm just going to put the URL here.
Oh, sure.
Oh, please do.
Yeah, we're not going to close this event out until it's there. So thank you so much to both of you. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Take care.
Looking forward to your novel, Mr. Gauyo. So.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
That's right.
Look forward to writing it.